read about a quilt, the Freedom Quilt, that a woman who was a cook at like a segregated school had registered to vote. Her employer found out. He fired her. She had no work, but she was they think part of a quilting co-op where she made multiple iterations of this quilt where she spelled freedom. Her name was Jessie Telfair. She was in Georgia, and it's the Freedom Quilt. And they think that she had that pattern of an alphabet from the ladies' art company, that she probably was doing this as part of a co-op to try to make some money since she lost her employment. And then I think you have like the G's Bend quilters were kind
Yeah.
of a co-op from that era. I'd have to do more research to really speak to that, but there were so many walks of life that were kind of involved in using quilting as a tool for all kinds of things.
Welcome to the Quilt Scouts podcast. I'm Megan, your Quilt Scout leader and fellow adventurous quilter. This is a cozy campfire chat for quilters who crave creativity, community, and a gentle nudge to try something new. Each week, we'll talk about quilting and the small adventures that help us grow more confident, one stitch at a time. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get into it. Okay, I know this week's episode is coming early, but today's episode is a little extra special because we are officially in part 2 of a crossover series with the Patchwork Revival podcast. And I'm joined by my wonderful friend, Emily, who you are about to fall in love with if you haven't already. But before we go any further, I need you to do something very important. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet over on the Patchwork Revival podcast, pause this episode, go listen to part 1, and then come right back here. I'll wait. Seriously, I've got snacks. I'm not going anywhere. Okay, welcome back. I assume you did your homework. Now we're picking up right where we left off, diving into quilting from the 1930s through today, exploring how quilters gathered, learned, adapted, and built community through some pretty wild moments in history. And I couldn't imagine a better guest for this conversation than Emily. Emily is the host of the Patchwork Revival podcast, where she shares the stories of quilters, past and present, and explores the rich, sometimes messy, always fascinating history of our craft. She is one of those people who makes you see quilting not just as something we do, but something that we are deeply connected to. So, Emily, welcome to the Quilt Scouts podcast. I'm so glad you're here. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Megan?
I'm doing great. We are continuing our conversation through the history of quilting in America. So we just recorded part 1 on the Patchwork Revival podcast, and we are continuing into part 2 on the Quilt Scouts podcast.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you haven't listened to part 1, go over to the Patchwork Revival podcast, listen to that, because we start from essentially colonial America through the 1930s. And now we are going to be picking up from the 1930s to present day, talking about how we used to gather as quilters, how we learn through our communities. But before we get into that, Emily, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners who may not know you yet and tell us a little about yourself?
Yes. Well, thanks for having me with you, Megan. I've been excited for this episode. Well, I guess I should say first, my name is Emily. I'm a quilter, first and foremost. I learned to quilt from my grandma when I was like 8 years old, and it just stuck with me through a lot of life. I am not 8 years old anymore. So it's been a couple decades now that I've been quilting. And I love quilting. I love talking about it. I love sharing it with people. So why not start a podcast? Because this is 2026. Um, my podcast, I really wanted to have it be a focus on quilters as people in the community and the connection that we can find through the quilts that we make, that we look at, that we love. So I wanted to just sort of bring kind of the community aspect of quilting into, the little side of the internet that is all about quilts and quilters. So that's kind of where I like to focus my energy on the Patchwork Revival podcast. Sometimes it's through interviews, sometimes it's through me just blabbing. And then sometimes it's from me actually trying to do some research and learn about sort of the historical parts of quilting, just as kind of a passion project of mine. Obviously, we made this disclaimer on the last episode or part 1 of the episode, but it's probably worth mentioning again. I am not a historian by training or trade. I really just love it, and have found sources that I like. I try to make it a point to go beyond, Google or whatever AI stuff, look at books and blogs and all the things. So there's great resources out there, but there's also a lot of holes. And, we can also, I think, use what we know in our own kind of context as quilters to kind of fill in blanks where we can,
Yeah.
ask questions where we need to. So thanks for having me. I'm really excited to maybe get to know some new listeners and just invite people into, the community that we're building.
Yeah, I'm excited you're finally on the Quilt Scouts podcast because I've been on the Patchwork Revival podcast way back in the day, and now we're finally having a little crossover series, if you will. But one of my favorite parts of your podcast is I feel like you really focus on sharing quilters' stories and like documenting their stories. And we talked a little bit on the last episode the part 1 episode we just recorded about how much of our history can be lost because a lot of it was like oral history, or we have to take into consideration who's documenting that history, and so much of it either gets lost or erased or things like that. So to have the opportunity to, in today's day and age, document quilter stories, I think is really, really cool. And I love that you're doing that, taking the time to do that.
Well, thanks. I mean, the internet is doing a lot of this for us, which is, very nice. But I learned to quilt from my grandmother, like I said, and there's like not a day that goes by. So when I quilt, I feel like I'm quilting with her still. Um, And I'm like, "Man, I wish I would have, like,
Oh,
remembered to ask her this," or,
yeah.
all that kind of stuff. Because
Yeah.
even with my interest in it now, um, I'm like, "I never asked her, when did she actually learn? Or did she ever? Or was it just like, 'Yeah, I know how to sew. Guess I'll start doing this,' kinda thing?" So
The questions you wish you had asked at the time. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. That's probably my bias and kind of trying to look back and be like, how did this happen? And how did this become something that we do? Just,
Hmm. Yeah, I think the history of quilting, just history in general, has always fascinated me. And like you just mentioned, we both did a fair bit of research trying to get ready for this episode because I am not a historian either or a researcher by any means, but it was really fun to dig into some different resources. I got online, went into the International Quilt Museum website. They're a great resource. I'll make sure to link anything that we do talk about. I'll make sure that I link it in the show notes. But it was really fun to do a deep dive into the history of our craft, our hobby, our art that we do, and learn a little bit more about where we come from as
yeah,
quilters, right?
for sure.
Specifically, we've been talking about the evolution of quilting, focusing on how we learned as quilters through the different decades and the centuries of quilting and how we gathered in different formats. We left off on part 1, essentially the 1930s, like post World War I is kind of where we had left off. So we are talking about the golden age of patterns, basically printed quilt patterns, which didn't exist previously. We just started to see that emerge in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, with patterns being distributed in printed formats, newspapers, magazines, like the Ladies' Home Journal, the Farmer's Almanac. And now we're kind of going into, like I said, the golden age of patterns where patterns are being written and distributed in mass production. So
Wow.
this really helped us go from patterns being shared locally, which we were just talking about on part 1, within a small community, to a larger community. Knowledge and information is being shared on a bigger scale, right?
Yeah. Did you come across the Ladies Art Company at all?
I think I did. That sounds familiar.
So this was like 1889. So
Okay.
kind of leading into this era and probably through this era was the Ladies Art Company, which was kind of a similar thing. Like they were producing, publishing, distributing patterns. Um, I wanted to shout out. So two of my kind of favorite books to go back and look at are, one is by Ruth Finley, who is a name that you'll come up a lot when you start kind of Googling history of quilting. And she has this book, Old Patchwork Quilts and the Women Who Made Them. And
Mm.
then there's also The Romance of the Patchwork Quilt in America by Carrie Hall. And I think it's, yeah, Rose Kretzinger. And the reason I brought these books up is because they were first published in like 1910s, 1930s ish.
Okay.
And both of these books made it a point to try to sort of gather patterns and say, like, draw pictures of it or do like plates, they called it, kind of a photographic evidence of a particular pattern and then collect all the names that they could find for that pattern. Because the names
Oh,
differed by region, but they would
yes.
also differ by publisher because, like, let's be honest, there's only so many ways you can arrange half square triangles or diamonds or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, people would put their own spin on it, their own flair, and they would publish it. And so it might come out under a different name, under Nancy Cabot or the Ladies Art Company or whatever. So
Mhm.
that was sort of too something I found interesting is I was like, even in this era, there were already people kind of like me who were interested in like, man, well, why is this called a churn dash here and a
Mhm.
monkey wrench here? And they
Ooh,
were, like, kind of just documenting that that was a thing.
yeah. I'm
Those books
almost
are
picturing, like, an
really
early
cool.
version of Barbara Brackman's
Uh-huh.
encyclopedia, right, where she
Encyclopedia.
does the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That's really cool. So they were
Cool.
taking the time to, like, gather and archive all that information.
Mhm. And they're really cool books. There's some text in there, and they kind of speak to quilting bees and how just kind of very basic batting and techniques and stuff. They're not really, like, instructional manuals, but
Okay.
I think they're a pretty cool insight into, like, what was quilting to people. So, interesting sources that I really like, and I recommend for people who might have an interest in this.
I've heard you mention those books before on your podcast, and I think you've quoted a couple of them too, and just the covers of them are really beautiful too. Those would be wonderful to have in a personal library.
Yeah, they are. I found one just by chance in an antique store here, and I was like,
That's cool.
"Yeah, I'm gonna get that."
That's a find.
Um, but here, this is a little segue, I'm sorry, I'm getting off
That's okay.
topic, but, there are a lot of antique stores, like thrift stores, but specifically antique stores here kind of in the downtown area. And when you go in there, you will find so many quilting books. Like, I have to keep myself under control sometimes. They're not always exactly what I'm looking for, but
Yeah.
like I walked through and found a book that was like Patchwork Quilts of 1988. I was like, well, I was born that year. I've got to get that book. And I'm like, I don't I don't really love the quilts in there, but it's like a book of patterns.
Yeah.
There's it's a gold mine out
I'll say
there, and
pro tip for anyone listening. So antique and thrift stores for quilt books
yeah,
is
at least
it's really
out
good
here
to know
in
because I was telling you that when I was trying to research for this episode, I went to my library, didn't have anything useful in my library. I was very disappointed. So when online I was trying to order books, I got a couple books, but again, the selections were still a little bit limited and I wasn't able to get them in like a timely manner. But so that would have been good to know. I'll have to go to like some thrift stores or antique stores around here and try to find some books and
yeah,
do some more research.
and I wonder too, like, I found one specifically that was like Texas Quilts, Texas Women, and it was published by, I think, like, the UT kind of publishing, and it was almost like this lady who wrote it, gosh, Suzanne Yabsley. I'm looking at it right now. I don't have that just, like, rolling off my tongue. But, it's almost like she did this research almost as, like, a thesis or something for, like,
Mhm.
graduate work, and so, um, I feel like it's, like, also these little pockets of, like, publishing houses and stuff through
Yes.
universities and whatnot that maybe they're just not, like, big enough runs to go find it on,
Yeah.
a library
Yeah.
shelf or something, but,
Yeah, that was
um
the problem I was coming across is that there are kind of hard to find, I think, because exactly what you just said. They're
Mhm.
not mass produced. There's probably small numbers that are being printed at a time. And Yeah, there's a lot of information out there. You just got to take the time to gather it. Like, so for example, you're talking about the book is specifically talks about Texas quilts and Texas quilters. I've noticed when I was looking for books that there's almost a book on every state. Like I found one in
Yes.
Colorado, it was Colorado quilts and quilters and the history of quilting in Colorado. So like you could theoretically find a book from every state and learn about that specific state's history on quilting.
Well, you know what? This is giving me another idea. We should do an episode on Colorado and Texas.
That would be fun.
Because now we know we can find resources for that. But it's interesting to try to condense like America
Mhm.
into a
Yeah.
timeline. But
Yeah.
I still find it a really worthwhile thing to do because it gives us as quilters in, the 2020s, like some context for what we are doing and what we're continuing to do and where all this knowledge came from.
Yeah.
So I I love that. I
I
love
find it fascinating.
yeah, and literally feeling a connection to some woman in 1920. Like
Mhm.
I'm just because this is like I'm getting a little wild here, but I'm like, people today who are taking, say, quilt pattern writing courses, do they even know and appreciate that, like, there were women building businesses doing this in the late 1800s and early
Mhm.
1910s or whatever?
Yeah.
There were women writing books on this, and I think that's so cool.
I feel like vouch that people do not know that because I was that person, 4, 5, 6 years ago taking a quilt pattern writing course. I had no idea, like no context of what had occurred prior to my online course that I was taking, remotely from my couch in my
Right.
sweatpants.
It's really cool to think about. It's really neat to think about.
I love getting to one, learn more because we've established I'm 100% a nerd, but getting to feel connected to the past and where we come from. And it's really fun to learn about. So,
Yeah, so this history is our history as quilters. And then also, I think it does. So, this brings up kind of a point, and I think this is an interesting place for us to transition from Patchwork Revival, where I tend to focus on like individual stories and journeys, because I feel like that's kind of what quilting was before this time when we had a little bit more wide distribution of patterns, even fabrics, kits, and things like that were starting to be kind of dispersed. I feel like that's when you kind of transition from, I'm doing this with my neighbors and my friends to I'm doing this because I want to quilt and I can get all this stuff. But there was still ways that people were finding community and doing it together. It just started to look different.
yeah, they were still so basically we are because patterns are being distributed more widely, you have a bigger group of people making the same quilt in a larger community essentially. It's just not these small little pockets where we're
Mhm.
gathering. The community has gotten bigger, I guess,
Yeah.
because knowledge is being distributed on a bigger scale.
Yeah. It's almost like now instead of talking about the quilting community out in rural West Texas, now we're talking about the quilting community in America. The 1930s is, an era of, pretty significant hardship in
Yeah.
our country. And, the New Deal with Roosevelt and all the things where they were trying to figure out, oh my gosh, what was it called? The Works Project.
Okay, I want to pause here for just a second and add a little bit of context because this is such a fascinating piece of quilting history. So, when we're talking about this moment in time, we're in the middle of the Great Depression, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt had launched what's known as the New Deal. This was a series of programs designed to get people back to work and support communities during what was a really difficult economic time. So, one of those programs was the Works Progress Administration, often called the WPA. And within that, there was something called the Federal Art Project. So, what's really special is that these programs didn't just focus on infrastructure and construction, it also invested in artists and makers, and that included quilters. So, through these initiatives, quilting groups and co ops were formed. especially in rural communities. So women were able to come together, create quilts, earn income, and preserve traditional patterns and techniques that may have otherwise been lost. Okay, let's jump back in.
Somebody's written a whole book on it, A New Deal for Quilts by Yannick Smucker. And it essentially talks about basically what kind of on like a bigger scale is I feel like this is when co-ops were kind of starting. When, like they were sort of the government was trying to sort of revitalize the like economy that was in complete shambles. And so they would kind of subsidize basically work for citizens. And so there were women who were and maybe even men, I don't know, who were involved in making quilts to try to find a job, make work, create work. Um,
So quilts as an industry.
yeah, I feel like it kind of started a thing.
Okay.
And then also think about too, this was the era like when my grandmother was becoming, um, kind of preteen, teenager-ish era, so she's starting to have to help, as more than a child. She's, like, starting to have to help around the home,
Contribute to the home.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, she talked about it a little bit and was like, "We weren't making quilts because we wanted to. We were making them because we had to." And so I feel like this is maybe kind of where we have that romanticized idea of, like, stretching everything we had, kind of creating abundance out of scraps
Yeah.
and making quilts that were really, for some people, necessary for
Yeah.
survival. I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of times we just gloss over, like, how bad this was for
How
people.
hard that was for people. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people were starving and, it was just terrible, so
But I would think that's a good reminder to know that we didn't always make quilts for fun. Sometimes, like
some
you said, it
people
was kind of,
probably still did, but a
yeah,
lot of people did not.
it was not maybe fun for them. Yeah, that's a really good reminder and a good perspective too to keep in mind talking about the history.
So then there's actual like co-ops where people are making quilts. But then besides that, I think that's really just kind of an extension through like, World War II era stuff. Like if
Mhm.
you had like certain fabrics and all that, I'm sure everything was just rationed,
Yes.
because they maybe a factory that had been producing like beautiful printed calicos now needed to be making like white muslin for bandages or a ticking stripe thing for mattresses or whatever. I think that's too a way that we kind of start picturing these scrappy quilts that we all kind of consider our early ancestors making, because this was sort of an artificial um, sort of scarcity, like era of artificial scarcity when, we had just different priorities as a country
Yeah.
for, supporting what we really needed to. And so I think there were plenty of women who were probably still just, quilting and maybe finding, I know that a lot of us today, when we quilt, it's an escape for us because just there's something about doing things with your hands that can help your mind. And I know too in this Texas Quilts book I was talking about, there was a woman who was talking about quilting in like the Dust Bowl. They couldn't get out, they couldn't do anything. But she was like, I had to quilt because the constant wind noise was driving me crazy. But if I was quilting, I was somewhat distracted from it. Isn't that crazy
Oh
to
my God,
think?
that's kind of nuts to think about.
I know,
Like,
it's actually kind of horrifying. But, things like that, I mean, we had a totally different kind of cultural context and stuff for the things
Mhm.
we were doing, but we still had humanity. Like, humans are humans, and we
Yeah.
have been. And so I think that was probably too a way, people were contributing to the war effort by growing their own vegetables, maybe making their own quilts and their
Mm.
own decor, and so that these factories could divert their, products and energy to supporting soldiers. So,
Yeah. So there's that community aspect of it coming
for
together
sure.
collectively to support the war effort, support our communities while we have people off fighting, right? And like you touched on, like the scarcity of materials and things like that as well, because, well, there's still lots of materials, but they're being diverted for other uses, right? Not necessarily,
Yeah. For our luxury of
yeah, exactly,
culture.
luxury items. This reminds me of, I was reading up on the feed sack quilts. Do you know anything?
Yeah,
I thought that was fascinating. And they were talking about
yeah.
like the printed bags.
Yeah, no, and that's why they did it, right? Was during, like, the 30s, it was kind of, I think, intended as, like, a morale boosting thing, and it's like, if you're gonna spend your money buying flour, you're gonna have this flour sack that you can do something with.
It was such an interesting history. I think there was an exhibit at the International Quilt Museum that I was reading up on because they featured all of these. So essentially, for people listening, quilts made from food bags, like the bags that your flours, your grains, your sugar, your salt, and things that would come in, right? Your corn, whatever. Because at the time, we're talking about Depression era, people were choosing between buying food and buying fabric to make clothes or bedding or whatever. Obviously, we're going to choose food most of the time. So
Yeah.
the companies that were selling these food products were putting their products in printed fabric. So like pretty fabrics rather than just like a cotton white bag or whatever. They were putting printed fabric so people could then buy the food and then reuse the bag to make garments or bedding or whatever. And the part that I thought was really interesting was that actually became like a marketing tactic. So you had,
Mhm.
several different companies that sold flour. They would choose the print of their packaging based on how desirable it would be in a garment. So it was just like women were choosing certain brands of flour over another because the bag was prettier and they could make a dress for their daughter or whatever, from it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was reading up on all that. I mean, I feel like you probably already knew all this, but I was like, this is so fascinating. One from being resourceful, but then also like the marketing part of it. I was like, well, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it is really cool. And then it's interesting too, because now we have, in our basically glut of fabric that you can choose from today, you can choose Civil War reproduction fabrics, you can choose 1930s reproduction fabrics, and those really mimic those feed sacks that people were using. And I don't know. I don't know how long that continued, but I
I
kind
don't
of was
either.
imagining it may have also continued kind of through the 40s, like the throughout the wartime period and stuff like that. And then I feel like the 50s probably kind of blended into that because that was, like, when we're just, like, rebuilding and having our
Exactly. Yeah.
baby boom and all that stuff,
I
so
think that goes from a period of scarcity to kind of more of a period of abundance in our country, where we do have kind of a good resurgence, and the economy is doing better. And now fabric has kind of gone back to more of a luxury item, where again you have the choice of which fabric and which art
yeah.
you're choosing and purchasing, right? And that kind of goes into the 1960s, 1980s, where we have what we refer to a lot as the quilt revival period.
Yep. 'Cause the bicentennial was 1976, so that was our 200-year anniversary after the American Revolution, when we had our independence, and, um, I didn't really appreciate how huge the bicentennial was, like, through
Yeah.
all walks of life, areas of the country, cultures, like, it was a big deal,
Yeah, it was a big deal because there was this.
like a celebration.
Yes. I think we're kind of seeing it again now this year with the 250th anniversary.
Mhm.
There's a lot happening around that in museums and whatnot, celebrating 250 years. But the 200th anniversary in 1976 was such a big deal because there was this renewed interest in again, romanticizing somewhat the birth of the country. So we
The
have this
colonial
resurgence.
era,
The
kind
colonial
of.
era, yeah, we have this new interest in American crafts, folk art, um, and the quilts went right along with that. So there was this
Mhm.
big resurgence in new quilters kind of coming onto the scene and joining the art of quilting at that time. With that, I think there was a lot of growth with more pattern production, more classes happening, more guilds probably
Like,
coming together
industry.
in groups of people coming together to like learn how to quilt, right?
Yeah. To learn how to quilt, an interesting thing that I found out as well is that so this kind of talks about quilting co-ops, which I haven't done a ton of research on, but I've just kind of keep stumbling across them. So, so in the civil rights era, the kind of grassroots movement of like the 1960s, where people from the North would come down to like the South that was still suffering under kind of the Jim Crow era, and they would basically encourage people to, no, you can register to vote. So here's how you do it. But there was a lot of just, really sad retaliative things that happened. Like I read about a quilt, the Freedom Quilt, that a woman who was a cook at like a segregated school had registered to vote. Her employer found out, he fired her. She had no work. But she was they think part of a quilting co-op where she made multiple iterations of this quilt where she spelled freedom. Her name was Jessie Telfair. She was in Georgia, and it's the Freedom Quilt. And they think that she had that pattern of an alphabet from the ladies art company, that she probably was doing this as part of a co-op to try to make some money since she lost her employment. But there was some documentation I read that essentially one of these kind of activist groups that had come and tried to kind of help Black people in the South find their footing and like kind of reject this disenfranchisement, um, to, you know, express themselves and find ways. And one of the ways they suggested that she do that after she lost her job was through quilting and through a co-op. And then I think you have like the G's Bend quilters were kind
Yeah.
of a co-op from that era. I'd have to do more research to really speak to that, but there were so many walks of life that were kind of involved in using quilting as a tool for all kinds of things.
You talking about a quilting co-op is the first I've heard of it. So for myself and then for listeners who maybe aren't clear, correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like a guild is like a learning community where we're making quilts for ourselves, learning how. A quilting co-op is a group of quilters coming together to make a quilt for sale to create income.
That's what my understanding is as well. So around the 60s, 70s, 80s, I think was when there were starting to have museums that were displaying quilts, which meant they were buying quilts, as part of their exhibits and things like that. And so I think the co-op was a way to sort of support communities financially by
Okay.
like, making quilts that they could sell to collectors or benefactors, things like that.
Interesting. That would be a fun one to research too and kind of dig a little bit more into the co-ops because like I said, I haven't heard of that before, but that does make sense in the context of what was going on in history too. So
Yeah.
interesting. So yeah, we have the growth of guilds, classes, quilt shows also kind of start to come on the scene here in this quilt revival period where we weren't really doing that so much beforehand, but it was just becoming a bigger part of the community, showing quilts, displaying quilts, they're being shown in museums, things like that.
Sort of becoming an industry, I feel like is when I kind of envision the quilting industry, because we did have books being published, patterns being published, kits being sold, and even in the 80s, like early 90s, if you were a PBS kid, you probably saw some like quilting shows.
Yes, I was actually going to talk about that. Yeah, going into the 80s and 90s, we're transitioning from, not to say from print media, because the print media is still there, printed patterns, but now we have the addition of televised quilting shows where now people are learning across the nation. We're all sitting down together to watch the same quilting show. So now we have information being distributed on an even bigger scale, televised. Georgia Bone Steel was the first quilt TV show on PBS, started in 1979. Um,
Okay.
yeah, so this is like right after the 1976 bicentennial, right? So 1979, Georgia Bone Steel. And then we also have the likes of
Eleanor. I was gonna say, you gotta be coming up with
Eleanor
Eleanor
Burns,
Burns.
right?
She
I
is
don't know when hers was. 90s?
I think it was so her company was Quilt in a Day,
Yeah.
and I think I kinda think they started 80s,
Okay.
90s. Maybe she had books and stuff published,
Yeah.
and she may have been self-published. I'm not 100% sure, but
I'm not
she
sure either.
yeah, she was the person who so her shtick was my grandma loved Eleanor Burns, and her shtick was, "How do I make quilting more efficient for moms?" Because she was a mom of many children, like 2 or 3 children, I think. And so, she came up with a way to make a log cabin speedier. Basically, she came up with, like, strip piecing.
Yes. Well, she's got her book still stripping.
Still stripping after 25 years, I have it. I love Eleanor
I
Burns,
love it.
and she was very prolific, and so she had a show, and then there's Fonz and Porter, Love of Quilting, which is still on PBS, but, um, Liz Porter and Marianne Fonz are now they're no longer, regularly hosting or attending the show, but they had it, and it was like I loved watching those shows because it was not just buy my stuff. It was like, "This is how we make a half square triangle," or, "This is how you sew it and press it," and I was like, it was instructional. It was really
Yeah.
cool.
So it's just a new way that quilters were learning at the time period. So we've gone from
Mhm.
having to learn in person in a class, in a guild, to learning from a printed pattern or instructions to now we have the television, right? And now we're learning on TV real time from these women, from these quilters who are hosting TV shows, which is super cool.
Yeah. Those are the big ones I know.
Yeah. Alex Anderson?
Hmm.
Do you recognize that name? I don't.
No.
Yeah, so Alex Anderson, she hosted Simply Quilts from 1998 to 2006. So a little bit more recent, but
Simply Quilts.
mhm.
Um, there was Nancy. Do you remember Nancy Zeman, Sewing with
No.
Nancy? She passed away a while back. She was the blonde lady. Oh, Simply Quilts. Okay, I recognize the face. I just Googled her so I could see if I This is this is a somewhat, embarrassing question. Maybe I should, email, Al Gore. When was the internet a common enough thing that people were posting stuff on the internet? Because I know, like, Quilt in a Day,
Yeah.
if theirs is it might have been the Quilter on Fire podcast, I wanna say, or maybe it was the Craft Industry Alliance interviewed Eleanor Burns. This was many years ago, and she was talking about how they literally would film and then sell the show to PBS, and it got picked up, and so then she would film in front of, like, a live audience and stuff, and then I kinda think they did some stuff on the internet also.
But
I
that
could be
probably
wrong.
would have been into, like, the mid-90s when
Yeah,
that was
that's
becoming more like a computer in the home was more commonplace,
right.
dial-up internet and all that fun stuff,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, because then we have the overlap, like you said, between TV and internet. So we're talking mid to late 90s, early 2000s, where that starts to become more commonplace. So we have TV shows that are still airing, but then we also have things like blogs, like quilting blogs are coming on the scene. YouTube
Mhm.
isn't a thing yet, but we have blogs, forums, and digital quilt patterns because, again, now we're able to distribute things via the internet. So there's that bridge, that gap between TV learning and digital learning that we're seeing at that time period.
Yeah, which is interesting too because I do feel like TV okay, so even if you were in, I don't know, 1955, I wanna make a quilt. I'm gonna buy a pattern. I'm gonna go to my catalog, find the pattern I want, send this off. I still have to reach out to have this
Yes.
knowledge come into me. But once you start talking about TV and internet, like, it's there. Like,
Yeah.
it's already with you. You have it right there with you. And also, this gets into a little bit of stuff, but it's, I think, important to remember that post World War II America, like, the golden age and the baby boom, that was when people's like multi-generational stuff was not valued as much, right? It was all about my satellite family. I'm going to go out, I'm going to make my own way, all these things. And I'm like, I feel like that's kind of when, like, well, okay, well, you can go buy stuff. It's probably cheaper to go buy a bedspread than buy fabric materials, spend time, making a quilt.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
It just became a little more society and culture became a little bit more isolated.
Yeah, disconnected is the word I was thinking of.
Yeah,
Yeah, isolated is a good word. Yeah, so rather than learning from your mom and your grandma, like you said, you've kind of removed yourself from that family, starting your own family, and now we're finding other ways to learn these skills.
yeah. But I think it's really cool to imagine that, okay, now we have a TV program where you're like, "Oh, quilting. Maybe I
Mhm.
wanna try that," or
And
whatever.
the thing too I like about that is it's free, right? Well, essentially, I mean,
Yeah,
let's
you
not
had to buy
trust the
TV or
TV
whatever.
and everything else like that, but, like, PBS, is its free television program, so it makes it more accessible, which is really cool. So you have more people able to get access that information, on a bigger scale for less,
Yep.
which is pretty cool.
Oh, I was also gonna say, I feel like the '90s was when my grandmother got, like, back into quilting. Like, I
Oh.
wanna say her and her sister, like, decided like, they would go out on these road trips and RV trips and stuff,
Like,
and
got
they
into it for fun at that point, or
yes,
for
and
necessity.
they kind of got into it back at this time. Like, they went to a
Mhm,
quilt shop and found a pattern, decided, how they wanted to do it, and they kinda did it. They each bought their little kit or whatever and
mhm.
did it, and then they would talk to each other, show each other, that kinda stuff. So,
Yeah.
I don't know as much about the development and sort of evolution of a quilt guild. Did you read much about that?
It wasn't really till, like, the Quilt Revival that we start to see guilds as we know them, like the '70s and '80s, where we start to get these structured groups where you have to p the present day guild as we know them, I feel like doesn't come on the scene until, like, the '60s and '70s,
Mhm,
is my
and that was
understanding.
probably just growing.
Yes.
And I can imagine that's when, it's always, it's kinda true. You always gotta look at the money and, like, economy and industry, and so TV programmers are like, "Hey, there's a whole bunch of people who wanna see this quilting stuff." So then I'm imagining we're having shops dedicated to quilting and fabric. They're probably having classes because, like Eleanor Burns would have Quilt in a Day. Her shows were filmed in front of a live class, like
Which I love that. That's so
yeah,
iconic, like a live studio audience.
I know, and they're, like, at machines, like,
Yeah.
sewing along with her. So I'm imagining too people saying, "Oh, well, I wonder if there's a class here
Mhm.
that I could try." So,
It
um
created that demand probably locally, so people are
mhm,
seeing it on TV and they wanted that in their local community, so I could totally see that, the demand being created and then the supply happening with new fabric shops, new classes, and guilds
yeah, kind of
happening in the communities.
community, like,
Mhm.
building itself around that kinda new perspective on quilting.
Yeah.
Because I feel like by this time, truly, like, truly, let's be clear, anyone of our generation and probably a little bit older, like, if you want a cheap bed covering, you should just go buy you one.
Yeah.
Like, making it is not is not the cheapest thing. And
Why
so,
buy a bedspread when I can make one for 3 times the cost and a month of my time?
yeah, and, like, many tears and curse words and some of my soul woven into it.
Exactly.
But I feel like this is when, like, if you're quilting, it's because you like it
Yes.
and you've found your people, you found your process that you really like.
It's becoming more of a hobby, a luxury like, is something you do if you have free time, expendable income, right? More
Yeah,
of a luxury, more of a hobby that you can do, and less out of necessity and scrappiness, I feel like.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. But I feel like there's always been quilters who want to emulate quilts of the Civil War era because they like those, like, really dark, saturated colors and the fabrics that they have, or people who, lean more towards the 1930s reproductions, and they wanna make a, like, sunbonnet suit out of feed sack fabrics, like, there's always been still this, like, connection to the style and the different eras that we
Mhm.
see, in our
Yeah,
history, so
yeah. I
um,
never really understood the 1930s reproductions until I was researching the feed sack.
mhm.
information. Because I always saw that like at fabric stores, like 1930s reproductions. I was like, okay, why that? Why is that so popular?
Why are there, like, 3D rectangles on a mint green
Yes,
background?
exactly.
Or, like yeah, strawberries or something.
Yeah, it's like the little ditzy, yeah. I never really
Yeah.
understood that, and I feel like now that I'm learning history and researching these things, I'm starting to understand the importance and the popularity of that, I guess is what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
and why it became a style at all.
Yeah.
Like, why
Mhm.
would it have changed? Here we go. Kinda neat.
So, I feel like that brings us into present day where quilting has now
Yeah,
become a global community. We're able to reach out across the world and learn from each other, and share information globally, which is really cool. Now we have YouTube tutorials happening through the internet. We have Instagram, TikTok, podcasts like this. So it's been a really cool evolution to see how we learn and how we have evolved as a quilting community that way.
yeah. In thinking about the internet, the main thing I think about, I'm like, and this is when stuff became instantaneous. I want to learn how to quilt. Bam, here's
Yeah.
this tutorial, or here's this pattern that I don't have to wait. I feel like a lot of the quilt shows would reference, like, they'd have like a companion magazine or something. They'd be like,
Mhm.
oh, yeah, we're making this pattern from this issue, so you still might have to go buy it. But now we can just download
Yeah.
patterns. We live in a place, time where we always look for opportunity for, how can we make money? How can we kind of capitalize on this trend or whatever? What I love about the internet is that the accessibility just, I think it can only serve to, invite people into a community that they might not have ever even imagined or known that they wanted or needed. I mean, I'm a working mom. I have taken one quilting class because it was offered on one Saturday when I was not on call, and I was like, "I can do that," and I was interested and thought, "I'll try it out." I can't make it to quilting classes, like, 9 out of 10 times. You might have to have childcare to do that or to feel like you can do that, and so I I love that there's so much knowledge out there at, the just touch of your fingertips.
It removes a lot of barriers for people.
It does, it
Yeah.
does. I still encourage people to find community because that's what quilting kinda is, like,
Absolutely.
um, even if you're just sewing in the middle of the night with a YouTube tutorial in the background or whatever, or listening to a podcast, a lot of people listen to podcasts while they sew. Um, you're part of something, You really are.
It's so funny because you mentioned an entry point for a lot of that was my story. Like, I went down a YouTube rabbit hole, and that's how I got into it. I just was watching these videos first. I was like, "Okay, well, I know how to sew. Like, I can figure that out." And that's how I started quilting. Like, I didn't have anyone that taught me, and my mom, my grandma, I didn't have anyone in my family that was a quilter that I was aware of. I learned later on that my great-grandma was a quilter, but she had passed, like, when I was very, very little. So that was my entry point, was YouTube. So, I mean, had someone not taken the time to make these videos and teach people on the internet, I would have never found myself in the quilting community. But even having started as a lone quilter, I mean, I was doing it on my own. I was just like on YouTube trying to figure out how to do things. There's only so much I feel like you can learn from that. Really, it does come down to having a community, whether that's an in-person community or an online community like Quilt Scouts. Like, we're learning from each other there all the time. Or just having, not even to learn, but to have that support, right? To have that feedback of like, yep, that's normal. That happens all the time, or or whatever, or my
Yeah.
blot looked like that too. Um, I just feel like that's important.
It is fun. I mean, important, and it's also just fun. Like,
Yeah.
we're allowed to have fun. I think we don't have enough fun as
I feel like
adults,
sometimes we
and
forget that.
we do. And, like, I remember I would go I mean, I was so lucky. I had 3 grandparents till I was 30.
Oh,
And I would go, like, even when I was quilting when I was in, like, undergrad and med school, like, trust me, I was not, like, showing my work to people and being like, "What do you think of this?" Or what if
you were a
but I
closet
would
quilter probably, right?
I
Me
kinda
too.
was, but because I was not really, like, ashamed, but I was like, "Nobody cares about this
Yeah, no one
except"
else is doing it.
Yeah. And so I would, go for, like, a week to my grandma's house, like, every couple months, I'd try to go for, like, a week, and we would hang out, and she would, like she kept a lot of her stuff in, like, pizza boxes, like,
Yes.
she would ask the pizza store for clean boxes,
Love it.
extra ones. This was, like,
Uh,
something I'm sure they saw on, like, a show, and
Eleanor
so
Burns mentioned it one time and, and it was
yeah. Well, she wasn't gonna pay for, like, a box,
no.
like, so she would, like, pull it out, open it up, and have, like, all these blocks for a project and, like, show me what she was doing. She would help me, like she'd just give me fabric from her stash. I mean, she had explosions of it everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
And so that was just fun. It was just fun, and I feel like we've, kind of found that with our, 9 patch and our sweater weather stuff. Even
Yeah.
just sharing things online, I'm like, "Why am I doing this?" Like, I get so angry about certain parts of social media, and then I'm like, "It's because I actually really like feeling connected to people on this level and through this." And I feel like that's why Quilt Scouts has been successful and so welcoming to people is because we're like, allowed to just enjoy what we're doing and make friends doing it, you know?
It's fun to be able to connect and share and laugh together over silly mistakes, you know what I mean? And be able to share that in a safe place where you feel like you're not gonna be judged or critiqued harshly, but we can just kind of,
Mhm.
like, laugh at it, like, "Yeah, that I did that too."
Yeah, yeah.
And, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I haven't been quilting very long, so I still feel like a new quilter, and I feel like the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know when it comes to what all quilting has to offer. But with all that being said, I feel like I'm learning right along with people, as we learn things together, tackle badges each month. There's so many times when I'm learning a technique right along with people. So, and I
Yeah,
learned from the scouts and the members, and it's been really fun. So,
I think that's basically what quilting is, right? Like,
mhm.
my grandmother did, she did so many different kinds, she would do patchwork, she did some paper piecing for, like, a double wedding ring pattern, she did applique, she did, like, red work or embroidery
Love
stuff.
that.
And so she was learning too because it was fun and she wanted to, and she kinda had those foundational skills. And so, I feel like that's what basically all quilters are doing. You're kinda learning, even if you're kind of in your wheelhouse, you're still, practicing, and it's funny because the more you do like, I've never cared, honestly, I have never cared about cutting points off patchwork, like triangles, flying geese,
Yeah.
whatever. I'm like, "Who
Yeah.
cares? Nobody cares about that. I don't care about it." But, like, now when I make my triangles and stuff, I've been doing it for long enough that I'm like, I don't cut my points off, and I don't think about it. I'm like, "Oh, my grandma was right." Like, if you just practice, so, like, you're always learning. It's a
Mhm.
practice, right? It's
Yes.
all about the process and progress.
Mhm.
You're never gonna be perfect, and I don't think anybody ever really wanted to,
Mm-mm.
you know?
As cheesy as this is, but it's like the journey, not the end destination, right? It's the process of
Mhm,
learning. And I feel like the idea of Quilt Scouts has always stemmed from is that challenging yourself and trying something outside of your norm, or pushing yourself, maybe outside of your boundaries a little bit. And this can apply to any level, whether you're a beginner or if you've been quilting for 30 years and you consider yourself an expert. I can guarantee there's probably something that you have not tried that's worth trying and worth being bad at to start with, honestly. Because the first time we try something new or a new technique or whatever, you're going to be bad at it. So being willing to be uncomfortable with that and try it anyway and try something new, I feel like that's where we grow, where we have fun, and where we evolve as quilters. So the badge system is kind of the purpose behind that, is pushing you to try something new and challenge yourself.
mhm, and I think that's what quilters have done from
Absolutely.
the beginning.
Whether they realize they were doing it or not, right?
Yeah, they were just like, "Hey, I gotta get this done," and I saw someone down there made this really cool pattern, and now I'm
Mhm.
gonna have to do that
Or,
because
or trying new ways to do things. Like you're talking about Eleanor Burns, her whole thing was finding new ways to do something quilters have been doing for a while, right? But how can I
Mhm.
do this better, more efficiently,
Yeah.
faster, whatever? So,
And I feel like contemporary, like, patterns are very similar, right?
mhm.
There may be, like, 1,000 ways to make a kind of traditional basket block out of
Yeah.
triangles, but, there's all different ways to do it.
Okay. So we've worked all the way from colonial era to present day through our YouTube phases and blogging and our online communities. It was a really fun conversation. I feel like I learned a lot. So thank you so
I did
much
too.
for doing with me. Before we wrap up, though, I always ask my guests a rapid fire series of questions. So the rules is you just have to go with your gut. Don't overthink it. Are you
Don't
game?
overthink it. That's my specialty, so no promises, but okay.
Okay. Prints or solids?
Prints
Learning in person or learning online?
online. I would love to learn in person, it just doesn't happen, so I do it online.
Machine quilting or hand quilting?
Machine.
Early bird or night owl?
Mm, More night owl.
Okay. What do you listen to when you are quilting? Podcasts, audiobooks, or silence, music?
Usually podcast, occasional audiobook, sometimes music.
Reproduction fabrics or modern fabrics?
More reproduction.
Modern or traditional quilting? Quilt patterns, I should say.
Traditional. A
Traditional.
modern traditional.
Okay. Thank you
That's
so
a
much.
lot.
So, one last thing, where can people find you if they want to find more Patchwork Revival studios? What's your socials? What's your website? Where can we find you?
Well, I'm grateful, and I hope that people will check out part 1 of the episode on the Patchwork Revival podcast, which is available Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, pretty much wherever you'd get your podcasts. I do have a website. It's www.patchworkrevivalstudios.com. I typically have show notes, kind of blog style show notes, maybe a little more detail there, so you can check those out if you want to. Some patterns, some tutorials, that kind of stuff. And then I'm on Instagram at Patchwork Revival Studios. So those are probably my big places:
Okay.
podcasts, YouTube, Instagram, website.
Okay. And do you have anything new and exciting coming up that you want to share?
I have some patterns that I'm hoping to I'm just sewing samples and kind of sharing them as they come out. So I have a couple of those planned for the year. And then before we know it, it's going to be time for the sweater weather sampler
Did they sweater
again.
weather season?
Yeah. So that's going to be, a big focus coming up. So stay tuned. There's a lot of really fun stuff.
Yeah. And that reminds me, I know you did a whole series on sharing stories from this past year's sweater weather sampler. So
Hmm.
if you want to hear more, if this is the first time that you're hearing the words sweater weather sampler and you want to learn more, head over to the podcast, check out her stories there. So
Yeah. We had, speaking of community, we had a really fun community of people participating in the sweater weather sampler. And a lot of people were kind enough to sort of write their stories and let me read them out loud and share them. So that was really fun and really special. And I was really grateful to get to share that with everyone because I feel like it's just, um, inviting people into a community and kind of showing people what quilting can really be and how we can really connect. So
yeah, that was a really amazing community that came together with the sampler.
it always is. It's always really cool. So,
Always.
yep.
All right, Emily, thank you so much. We'll talk
Thanks,
soon.
Megan.
If you enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to follow or subscribe to the Quilt Scouts podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have a minute, leaving a review is one of the best ways to help this podcast find other quilters who could use a little creativity and community too. You can find show notes and more from Quilt Scouts at quiltscouts.com. Until next time, happy Trail Scout.